She will be speaking after me. And after her, our colleague Dan Pope. Dr. Pope is a senior lecturer in public health at the University of Liverpool in the UK in their Department of Public Health, and is the principal investigator on the LPG adoption in Cameroon evaluation studies, or LACE studies. He'll be telling you about that work. He has been collaborating with us to understand how to support increased adoption of LPG in Cameroon and potentially in other parts of the world over time. So we're going to cover in 3 parts today some general information about Global LPG Partnership and our high-level work in Cameroon. Then Bessem will take you through some of the details of a microfinance pilot project that we launched there and how that has been going and what we have been learning from it. And finally, Dan will update us on the evaluation work that his team has been doing in Cameroon regarding the health impacts of LPG adoption in that country. We will have questions addressed at the end of all 3 presentations, so please accumulate them and then we will address them. If you could advance the slide, please. So there's one bit of what Americans call fake news in our presentation, and it's this picture. This picture shows a traditional wood-based fire on the left, or charcoal-based fire on the left, and then the same household cooking with emissions-free LPG on the right, but it's actually not from Cameroon. This happens to be a Ghanaian family, but the same story works everywhere. So I can attest that this is the only bit of slightly imperfect information in the whole presentation. You've seen it, it's out of the way. But we start with this in order to visualize the profound effect that having a truly clean solution in a household has on the environment. I imagine everyone joining this webinar knows about this clean cooking problem and how many people are affected. The statement that 1 billion of the 3 billion or so people who do not have clean cooking today can be served by LPG comes from an analysis done by the International Energy Agency a few years ago. And in one of their scenarios for examining how energy access can be achieved, they thought that the proper sizing of LPG ought to be 1 billion. They will be updating that later this year. We expect that number to rise substantially from 1 billion, assuming countries do everything right to make the LPG successful. So we'll be talking a little bit today about what is involved in that and how we are helping some countries, including Cameroon, navigate their way to maximizing the potential for LPG in their countries. A key point is that LPG is going to be with us for at least another half century because it is a byproduct of the fossil fuel industry worldwide. And much as many people would like to see the fossil fuel industry go away, while we have it, we're going to have LPG whether we want it or not. And it's going to go into things like plastics and automobiles and forklifts and various other industrial uses if it doesn't go to clean cooking. So our view is that directing LPG into markets comprised of residential households in developing countries is the best moral use of LPG. And then, as the Alliance says in their overview slide, one must enable the markets, expand the supply, and encourage the demand in order for large-scale LPG use to be realized. And so we'll be talking a little bit about all those things, and in particular, the demand side later in this presentation regarding the role of microfinance. Next slide, please. There are a number of low and middle income countries who have brought LPG to very large portions of their population. This chart shows a few of them. What they have in common is that they have done the right things in terms of enabling environment, developing and investing in supply and distribution, and unlocking demand over a number of years. This shows that a country on its own can do this. Because many countries have not, we were formed. Next slide, please. The reasons countries do not have those kind of successes when they would like to is typically these four things, with variations from country to country. National governments have lacking or weak policies with respect to LPG specifically, and sometimes energy overall. They may have a market structure which is dysfunctional and doesn't allow an organic scale-up of the LPG market. They may enforce regulations badly, which lead to black market activities and other things that impede the development of a safe and orderly market. And as such, the markets don't develop well, and the investment that is made to try to cause the markets to develop, supply to expand, and demand to rise are wasted. Second, LPG, although it's very plentiful on a worldwide basis, may not be reaching the country for a number of reasons, or once it's there, it may not be reaching the households. Third, the local market, local sector may lack access to capital or access to knowledge necessary to build out robust infrastructure and distribution to reach the households who would like LPG but do not get it or cannot get it today. And for a portion of the consumers, the upfront costs to switch to LPG, a stove, a burner, various accessories, and the cylinder that the LPG comes in, those costs can be prohibitive when faced with them all at once. So, and these factors affect not only rural customers, but also urban ones. There's a huge opportunity in reaching that billion-plus goal across many, many countries to address both urban, peri-urban, and rural markets. Next slide, please. The Global LPG Partnership was formed in 2012 in dialogue between industry and the United Nations as a public-private partnership to help countries address these kinds of gaps and common issues. Today, it comprises about 40 host and donor governments, UN agencies, NGOs, development finance institutions, and impact investors, and leading international LPG companies who provide expertise. We help countries to build up and coordinate their ecosystems for LPG by bringing expertise and financing. We help consumers switch to LPG through education, microfinance, and other forms of support. And then we help academic researchers like Dr. Pope pursue evidence-based research around LPG and its impact on the health and the environment. Next slide, please. The most important thing we do in the beginning with each country is to help the country create the necessary enabling conditions for investment in the supply to work and not be wasted, and for demand to be found and served, and where necessary, unlocked. There are 6 main pieces to that, and I'll just very quickly touch on them. One needs to have effective market rules so that legitimate companies who invest in LPG can actually get a return on their investment and maintain safety of the LPG equipment. Safety is vitally important because if you don't have it, you get accidents and explosions, sometimes fatalities, and when you have that, consumers don't want to buy LPG. And when they don't want to buy LPG, people don't invest in it, and financiers don't provide capital for it. The countries which achieved very big penetration successes, as shown on the earlier slide, have solved the issue of safety and in turn have created environments in which investment in equipment, infrastructure, cylinders, and distribution have paid off and created lifetime customers. Number 2, the fuel supply has to be stable, because if there are shortages, none of this works. People do all sorts of imaginative things to deal with shortages, many of which are destructive to a well-ordered, well-functioning market, and in fact undermine the confidence in LPG that is needed for LPG to take its rightful place in the national energy ecosystem. Certain policies are necessary in order for all of this to work. If you don't have them, things tend to go slowly or badly, and if you do, they tend to go better and well. Industry by itself often doesn't develop high retail density to maximize access for the consumer, but it can with the right structure and incentives. We help countries develop those kinds of strategies for causing the private sector to be as widespread as, say, Coca-Cola is in reaching the public, rather than concentrating on easy-to-serve niches in cities and so on. The industry has to be effectively and professionally managed and execute well on its distribution safety obligations, and we can provide training and best practice knowledge and so forth and partnership for that. And finally, we have found that countries, whether they were on the list of great successes or on the list of those who try and want to be great successes eventually, they need some form of master plan specific to LPG to coordinate all of these things. Without a plan, the complexity of the LPG supply chain causes development to be somewhat random and therefore often full of false starts and boom and bust cycles, and large-scale penetration does not happen and then is not sustained. So these enabling conditions we find across all the countries where we have worked and all the countries we have studied are essential for LPG to be well developed and to scale up. Next slide, please. Our process in a given country has 4 stages. We always start on the left, which is to plan with the government and all other relevant stakeholders what to do, how to do it, in order to have a clearly defined national goal achieved. That inevitably leads to a series of reforms, enhancements to the enabling environment, and a set of investment projects to be carried out. In the second phase, we prepare those in detail, and we will also begin to do pilot projects like the one you'll hear about later to support consumers and small businesses to expand the demand side of the value chain and last mile distribution. Then we will do the financing and implementation of the plan in partnership with both local actors and various international providers of resources and funding. And we will also work closely with researchers and academics to design the monitoring and evaluation of the national program, which we then look to outside groups who have no inherent conflict of interest with LPG or bias with respect to LPG to monitor and evaluate and determine whether the social impacts that we hope to gain from the beginning are in fact being realized, and if there are things that can be done to tune the system to achieve more of them faster. Next slide, please. So today we have about 20 countries who have requested the kind of assistance you're going to hear about shortly to expand LPG use. And our 3 highest focus countries for this are Cameroon, Ghana, and Kenya. In Cameroon specifically, the National Master Plan has been approved after a couple of years of work, and we're now focused with the government and stakeholders on the implementation and financing of that plan. And we've been carrying forward a pilot program in microfinance that you will hear about in detail from Bessem a bit later. We've also partnered recently with the Economic Community of West African States to develop a policy framework for all of West Africa, which can guide the individual member nations in enhancing their own policies to make LPG more successful country by country. And we have been working closely with a number of development finance institution partners like the African Development Bank and the World Bank and so on to deepen and expand their own activities in financing with respect to LPG. Next slide, please. With respect to Cameroon, next slide, please. Cameroon has about 18 million people today who do not have access to any form of modern cooking solution. So that's our potential target for LPG. And you can see there that they are one of the reddish countries on the global map of who does not have access to modern fuels. They are at the northern edge of Central Africa. Next slide, please. So in 2014, we were requested by the government to help them develop a multi-stakeholder national master plan for LPG. And the target set by the government was to expand LPG access by 2030 to 58% of the population, based on analysis the government had previously done about what they thought was a reasonable and attainable target. The government consulted us about how to organize themselves for this, and then established a cross-ministerial multi-stakeholder committee and working group, which we facilitated and guided in 2015 to carry out and oversee the planning work and the studies that were necessary and so on. And by December 2016, the plan was completed and officially adopted and announced to the media by the government. So that was a roughly 14-month process from start to finish. And that's typical of the kind of speed with which we've seen countries who do not have distractions be able to complete this stage of work. Next slide, please. This was the structure of the committee that was originally implemented. What happened was that the gray boxes spun out. So the work of the national planning work was carried out by the white boxes. The first gray box investment committee was then established this year to focus specifically on implementation of the plan, as you'll see. And then the communications piece has shifted into certain other subgroups rather than become a standalone body. Next slide, please. This is it shows in detail the timeline of what has happened in Cameroon so far. I will draw your attention to a couple of points here. In phase 2, you'll see after the establishment of the National LPG Investment Committee in the green area in the center of the slide, we've started on project preparation of 4 main projects, representing about 400 million euros of total investment to reach that 58%. That comes to about 118 euros per household of new investment in order to serve those additional households. It's about 3.5 million new households, including growth in the population between now and 2030. The government is now diving into the specific implementation details of regulatory changes that they wish to push through at the end of the year. And the investment group believes they will keep to the schedule of being able to begin investments in cylinder inventories. That's about 230 million euros, and value chain expansion for the remainder at the end of this year and into next year. The evaluation will then begin probably in 2018 as the first wave of new customers, many hundreds of thousands of households, come online, and health and environmental impacts can begin to be assessed. Next slide, please. We do this not necessarily because we want to create lots of business for LPG companies, although that's a byproduct of the work. We do it because we want to help a lot of lives. So the impact that is expected from all of this is 18 million new users. That's not the same 18 million as before, because this is 18 million users through 2030, whereas the 18 million before is the number we're not served today. So we're not going to have 100% of the Cameroon market. We'll have 60% of it using LPG. And that represents 18 million as of 2030 if the country grows at its present rate. There'll be 30,000 lives saved from the elimination of household air pollution, including some stacking modeled into that number. We expect to save 15 million trees a year, take 3.4 million tons of CO2 out of the national emission profile every year, create about $100 million of new economic activity across the value chain annually, and create about 18,000 jobs. So these are why the politicians of Cameroon want to do this. Next slide, please. So how does microfinance fit into this? we have a hypothesis, because this microfinance for LPG, we have not found a systematic and scientifically designed approach taken to trying to do LPG microfinance in our research. So we said we're going to do our own. So our hypothesis is that if you combine microfinance with appropriate consumer education, you can accelerate the adoption of LPG by poorer households as you expand the supply. And in so doing, you can increase the social and environmental benefit of rolling out LPG and also reduce the risk of the investment in the infrastructure. And we wanted to understand potentially how big an impact that could have overall. Was it modest? Was it substantial? Was it minor? At least with respect to Cameroon. So after about a year of planning and forming appropriate partnerships that Bessim will tell you about, we launched in February of this year our first microfinance pilot in Cameroon. And the overall objectives of this are listed on this page, and they're worth spending a moment understanding. So the first question is, can this be done in a commercially viable way? Because if it is, then you might be able to have impact and scale it. Are microloans a useful tool to expand demand when you increase supply and distribution, or not? What impact do they have on the adoption of LPG for people who don't use LPG, never have, or did once and stopped for some reason? What impact do they have on the use of LPG over time? Do you create long-term customers or trial customers only? Which kind of consumers are the right ones to be targeted by microloans? And finally, what conditions favor and what barriers exist to being able to scale up microfinance if it shows that it does work? Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Bessim Enonchong, who was one of the architects and the on-the-ground evangelist and army leader of the forces for beneficial LPG microfinance in Cameroon over the past couple of years, to give you a deeper view of what that project is and what we've been learning from it so far. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and over to Bessim.
Thank you very much, Alex, for the transition as the commander in charge for Cameroon. Thank you very much for the audience so far. Next, please. So this afternoon we'll be looking at a typical pilot for microfinancing for LPG, which is actually the first of its kind in Cameroon. And before we get into the details of the microfinance, we just want to have a look at the LPG market in Cameroon. There's a rising middle-class population, and this has led to an increasing awareness of clean cooking solutions, notably LPG. The national consumption has grown 9% in the last 10 years. When we talk about 9%, is a figure that we have seen year on year. But the penetration itself is about 20% of the population when you look at one of Alex's slides. And it's this figure generates mainly from the middle and the upper income households. And the reason for this being that the households with less income have difficulties in having the upfront costs of acquiring LPG household equipment, which is a cylinder, a cook stove, a regulator, and gas hose. At the same time, there are negative health impacts of cooking with traditional biomass fuel and kerosene, which the community as a whole, the population, does not have. They don't have any information, and because of that, they just stick to their regular fuels that they've been used to. And also, there's a lack of cylinder investment by the LPG commercial companies. As of now, with a population of over 22 million, we have 3.2 million cylinders approximately circulating in the country. So we see that as grossly insufficient to meet the demand. Next, please. So in order to overcome some of those barriers, there is need for solutions to come up in order to ease switching from the biomass to clean cooking. LPG in itself, it's affordable, but the switching costs are high. When we look at the graph in front of us, we see LPG with advanced stove, the costing, we see kerosene, and we can see that the charcoal or wood are very costly, but most often the households don't see it because they purchase regularly on daily basis. And a pile of wood costs about $1 or 99 cents. So when these purchases are made on a daily basis, the households don't see the total amount at the end of the month. So to them, they have the impression that using charcoal or wood is cheaper, but if they do it cumulatively per month, they'll see that it's relatively expensive more than the LPG. Next, please. So the microfinance pilot, codename Bottle Gas for Better Life, this was actually a name that was initiated by the beneficiary community, Batoke. The objective is offering small loans to make it easier for households with low or seasonal incomes to afford the household equipment on LPG. And at the same time, increasing community awareness of the benefits of clean cooking through an elaborate educational campaign and cooking demonstrations. So we had sessions where we demonstrated how the LPG equipment is used. So there was actually a meal that was prepared on that day, and the people of the Batoke community shared that meal. So some of the goals are to determine provision, how effective it could be to convert users of biomass or kerosene to LPG for cooking, and equally to target borrowers who can repay over a commercially acceptable percentage of the loans, and that such financing should be commercially replicable and scalable for most of the project partners. And if a successful model is created, it will have equitable access across all the regions. So the microloan that we'll be looking at was held in the Southwest Province in Batoke, which is situated 11.5 kilometers from Limbe. Next slide, please. So for this phase 1 pilot, we have, of course, the Global LPG Partnership, who initiated, and fund provider. The fund provider, not because it's the Global LPG Partnership main core component, but because most of the financial institutions that we approached, they were somehow conservative. It has never happened before. LPG is not a sector that they look at. So they want to behave like, we may say, Thomas in the Bible, seeing before believing. We equally had the Ngango Association, Batoke, was the beneficiary community. And we want to say that the Global LPG Partnership did a lot of groundwork for this association to be created. Because when we went to Batoke, nothing like this was existing. But for them to be able to go through the microfinance institution, they needed to have an association. So Global LPG Partnership assisted them in the creation of this association. We have the MIFA, Microfinance Institution, Loan Management. At this point, MIFA, the microfinance, did not provide the loan for the reason that we've just stated. They decided to keep a conservative approach. And we have Kosan Chris Plan with their product local gas, who are the LPG equipment providers. And we have the University of Liverpool and the Douala General Hospital, the independent project evaluation. I think after me we'll have Dr. Dan Pope, who's going to talk to us about what they've been doing. Next, please. So why did we choose Batoke? Maybe because the country director is sitting in Limbe, but most of all, it came highly recommended by the Limbe City Council. It's the governing council of most of the communities, and the Batoke community is highly organized. The chief, Chief Otto, is very open to socioeconomic ventures, and he's done a project like this before, even though not exactly the same model. He's brought in a water supply in the village, and currently he's working with a cement company. So the village chief is very open. And Batoke is equally close to the LPG company, Coast Plan, which is a vital aspect in terms of accessibility and availability. It's a community that is made up of over 20,000 inhabitants. They have a high seasonal income, and their most preferred cooking fuel before we came is firewood and charcoal in some cases. Next, please. So what did this loan comprise? One, the equipment. You have the cylinder, as you can see. It's a 12.5 kilogram cylinder. It's a preferred size in Cameroon because of the fact that the supply is not very consistent. People rather have the 12.5 than the 6 kilogram. A double burner cook stove, a hose, and a regulator. And the loan amount in itself is 50,000 francs CFA, equivalent to US dollars 81. Started in February 2017, and the money repayment over 6 months, interest free. And for a household to be beneficiary, they needed to make a security deposit of 7,500 francs. This is to show interest, and this deposit is supposed to be reimbursed upon full repayment of the loan. Next, please. So the microloan doesn't stand on itself. It goes with education, consumer education and awareness. So the first we did was a cooking demonstration, like I said earlier on, in the village community. The traditional council convened the whole community. We had that day over 120 households gathered, showed them how the LPG connects itself, how the equipment is used, what they can do to optimize on the fuel. At the same time, leaflets were distributed, and these leaflets carried information on the usage and the benefits, on how to save gas, most especially because we realized that at times users complain that their gas don't stay long, or they cannot use it over a long period of time. They can't cook meals on it because they lack some techniques on how to save the gas. So a demonstration was made so that they can actually see for themselves on how to better use it to optimize their spending. And calendars were equally produced that carried safety instructions. We decided to use calendars because calendars, they can have them up all year and they can even stay. So it's not only for them to check their dates, it's a way of them to have themselves informed all the time, and they can always refer. And at the same time, these calendars are supposed to be used for them to monitor their refills. It means when their gas gets finished, they want to go for an exchange, they can actually make a circle, and this will enable them plan their budget and to know exactly when they should be preparing for their next refill. Next, please. So on the implementation side, the registration was held in the Batoke community. The building we see is the first home of the chief of the village, Chief Otto. So he was very active from the beginning and until now. So the registration, the households came with initial security deposit, worth 7,511 US dollars. And they had a repayment card. So all their information was in that card, their names, their age group, what they do for a living, and identity cards. So these repayment cards are equally used each time they come to do repayments, and it equally helps us track if there are any seasonal disparity in terms of when they have available funding. So we see that at the registration side, we had information about LPG itself. As they are registering, they could read on the benefits. We had information about the project partners, and we had information on the loan equipment in itself and the total amount. So there was much visibility so that every person in the community was able to see what was going on. Next, please. Next, please. So this is the day of the distribution of the equipment. No, sorry, can we get back? Thank you. It was actually a launch event. We had representatives from government offices, from the Ministry of Water and Energy, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Environment. We had other local chiefs take part. So it was a big event. So we see here all the 150 beneficiary households receive their equipment. And this project, of course, runs from February to September. Next, please. Some of the characteristics of the participants, we looked at their income range. Most of this data was given to us by Dr. Dan Pope and his team, and also at the time when the households were registering for the loan. So we see a high level of income from $93 to $183 on a monthly basis, and we see a seasonality of income being reported at 74%. Next, please. So some of the preliminary analysis of the characteristics, which is came out very strongly, was the fact that 66% of participants reported having secondary education. This is very important because we left them, as you saw in the former slide, we left them with calendars where they had to read some of the safety instructions. We gave out brochures carrying out health benefits, environment. So it was very important for any member of that household to be able to read. We realized that most of them, 66% of the participants reported to have that secondary and higher education. And the household comprised of 4.5 members per family. Some went up to 6. And the profession of the participants, you can see most of them are farmers, business owners. When we say business owners, they are mainly petty traders. We have some government employees, because Batoke is like, it's not only an indigenous community. You have people from different regions of the country who are living there. So most of these government employees, you'll find teachers, you'll find nurses, you'll find council workers, and you had also day laborers who had their own professions as private people. Next, please. So what we have in front of us is the primary cook fuel. We see that wood comes up very high. So this is the fuel that the people actually pay for, the households they pay for. They buy wood and sawdust. So we see that the portion that is paid for is equally higher than what is not paid for. Next, please. So what are some of the microloan highlights that came up? Is the first ever in Cameroon. It's an innovation. It took time to talk to the financial institution for them to understand. It took time to equally share the vision with the LPG companies. And it's the first time that these loans are explored in the banking and financial sector. And it was well received on all fronts. So we have key holders in government ministries of Cameroon who called and who sent emails to acknowledge the program. We had other peri-urban and rural communities who came within 4 weeks of the launch of the Bottle for Gas Better Life project, like the neighboring village, Wovia, who requested for the same program. And we have other villages like Botalan, Kie, Mabeda, and Bimbia. Besides this, we equally have the MIFA network, who equally came back, the ones in Douala, because we worked with the MIFA in Boya Southwest region, and the MIFA of Douala, Littoral region of Cameroon. They came requesting for the same. We equally have distribution companies like Tradex and Libya Oil who expressed interest. So the MFI MIFA network We are currently planning a second phase with them. Next phase. This is the most interesting part, the loan repayment rates to date. The figures that you have on the screen are figures that were reported on Friday, but we have updated figures. At this time, we had 66% complete payment of about 88 households out of the 150. But as of this Monday the 18th, we have 100 households who have paid, means 12 more paid over the weekend completely, and in all the other categories. So we have an increase in the lent capital over time. So if we are doing the analysis and we are looking at the number of repayments so far, we are calculating equally the amount of lent capital that has been repaid, which is high. So as of today, we have 100 households out of 150 who have done their complete payment. And we have 9.3% who have repaid over 35 to 39,000, 2% who have paid 40 out of 49,000, and we have 8% that have repaid less than 24,000. And we want to acknowledge that the repayments are ongoing, and I've just been receiving text messages that 5 more have repaid, and we are hoping that before the close of the month of September, we'll have all the 150 repayments, or we could say 148. That's our best estimate. Next, please. So what has been some of the trends that we've seen so far, already extended in the former slide. So 3.3% paid upfront on the day of, as a registered, 3.3 paid upfront. And when we asked them why they did so, we took 1 month to communicate on the program by the use of the roadside banners, by walking around the community with the researchers. So they decided to gather their funds and they paid upfront for the loans. So they were 3.3%. 4% completed the full payment at the 5th month. 41.3% overpaid the first payment, and 43.3% overpaid also the second payment. All households made the first 2 payments in the month of March and April, but the number of households making repayments declined with each repayment cycle and increased again in the last months. So I think in the middle of the month of the repayment, which is June, July, the repayment slowed a little bit, and since the households knew that the loan had to end in September, it picked up again in the months of August and September. That's why we look forward to have the maximum at the end of this month. Among those who did not complete their payments, majority stopped at the month of June, like we said, but they've picked up in the months of August and September. Next, please. So what has been some of the effects of this microloan on the LPG consumption? So overall increase in LPG consumption in Batoke. These figures reported by the Local Gas Regional Manager. Local Gas is the LPG commercial partner, and analysis are still going on. All participating households except one purchase refills, because this is very important. The objective of the loan is not for one-off. Our expectations are that the household should continue using LPG. So we have them, they've purchased refills, 1% they purchased 5 refills until now, 40% have purchased 3 refills, 53% have purchased 2 refills. So it's only one household that cannot purchase any refill. Although ability and improving affordability increased LPG adoption in the community, other issues such as learning to cook with LPG for all meals will take time to address. So we are saying that we do not expect to have a 100% switch to LPG now. It's a process. The households, communities are being used using LPG. So if overall we attain 80–85%. Next. Some of the lessons we want to share with you today on the pilot phase of the microloan is that we have 4 critical factors that have emerged so far. The first one is good project management. Strongly held by the Global LPG Partnership came together to make this pilot phase a success. We have the community sensitization, education and awareness. The chief of the community, his traditional council, and the households in the community actively took part, and partnering with reliable and established learning institutions, and the loan recovery, of course. So the first two give credit to the Global LPG Partnership and the community, and we have the microfinance, which is also very important, and loan recovery. It's a key one. It's a key success area if the microfinance has to scale up. Some of the questions that we are still answering and analysis are still going on is how many new LPG users were created as a result of microloans provided, or how many were revived, because we realized that it's not only the new users. We had users who had stopped using LPG for one reason or the other. Either they could not find their brand, either there were problems of infrastructure, they could not get the LPG. And equally, what are some of the characteristics of participants who adopted LPG and who made timely repayments? Some of the reasons that we observe for repayment patterns. Is it about season? Is it about other issues? Analysis still going on. And we are looking at how the microloan in itself can help at the national level for LPG adoption based on some of the indications that we are having now with Batoke. Next, please. If we want to consider the microloan, consider it for expansion, it will be key for us to look at some points. We have the choice of the community. We saw that Batoke, it's a peri-urban village, high reliance on firewood. So the choice of the community will be paramount. And the sensitization, this is equally key. And the sensitization should be done by everybody, Global LPG Partnership, the community and its council, the research team, and it should be done intensely, minimum 4 weeks. Even the beneficiaries, so we're looking at those who want to switch, the first time users, as well as a secondary target who are existing LPG users who have stopped for one reason or the other. Next, please. The registration of households, it was very effective. Sorry. And but time consuming. We have equally to be able to track the usage, a reliable microfinance institution, and the security deposits. Next, please. So what are the next steps for microloan in Cameroon? Looking at most of the learnings about the fact that it's time consuming, the fact that the operations are very rife. We are thinking of transferring it to a microfinance, co-funding, and for collection responsibilities. So we talk about collection responsibilities, we are talking about following up with repayments. And we want to give the microloan at this time to charge it at market rate interest, because it's very important that the community and the households get used to the fact that they have to pay interest, because they should be such time as to cut off the non-commercial to being a commercial loan, and to adjust the microfinance margins to equally cover the incremental project costs. Because talking to some of the microfinance, we realize that most of them, if we look at the value of the loans that they have the habit of giving out, and they look at the costs they use in collection of the loans, the costs are usually very high. So it's important that margins are adjusted so that the microfinance can cover some of their costs. So we want to involve a microfinance parent bank in funding and operations where appropriate, and identify communities and villages, considering new regions, because for now we are working with the southwest region of Cameroon, so be thinking of going to both English and French speaking regions. And why not go to the northern part of Adamawa, where we have the highest level of deforestation. So we want to equally think of engaging fully additional microfinance based on their geographic coverage and capabilities. We want to equally increase focus on women's empowerment through microfinance affiliated networks. Just so we know, the MIFA that we use is a 100% women organization, women MFI. I equally want to expand the public awareness about the benefits of LPG through increased project publicity. And lastly, to develop larger data set and analysis on LPG adoption, use, and loan performance to further guide consumer empowerment actions in support of the National LPG Master Plans. As I round up, I want to share that the experience that we've had with the microloan in Cameroon, we are seeing the results now, that it is work that took about 2 years. And from what we've seen so far, not putting emphasis on the repayment of this pilot, we can see a country, we can see a sector, the banking and finance sector, who is aware, and they are having great interest. They have other projects or other products that they might want to run as an institution. But when we talk about LPG, we are talking about numbers. We are talking about small loans, and we are talking about numbers. So they've realized that taking part in a microfinance like the one that we are piloting now in Batoke, it may have small margins, but it's going to spread over a long time. So the pilot has really raised awareness, and even in the communities in where we're taking part, we have the local government coming to us and encouraging the initiative. And so we think that the pilot, if we had to grade ourselves, we'd say it was a success, or it is a success, and we're looking forward to expand it to whatever level the government of Cameroon is ready to go with us. Thank you very much.
Right, thanks very much, Bessem. Yeah, I'll sort of take over from here. You'll notice I've got pictures actually from Cameroon. This is one of our participants. You can see her working in her kitchen with an open fire, and then when she switched to gas, how much cleaner the environment is. So there you go, Alex, you can use that in future. But I'm going to follow on from the presentations by Alex and Bessem with a discussion of work we've been carrying out in Cameroon to understand issues around scaling adoption of LPG from a community perspective. The LACE studies began in 2016, and I'm going to be discussing our first two projects, LACE 1 and LACE 2. Next slide, please. I'm going to briefly introduce LACE 1, including how we collected the data, before presenting some of our preliminary findings as we begin to analyse the full data set. I'm then going to discuss LACE 2, which was designed to build on our evaluation work, identifying approaches to support communities adopt and use LPG in a more exclusive way. We're getting to the final stages of data collection for LACE 2, so I haven't got any results to present, but what I will do is talk about the next steps, including a public and stakeholder engagement event we're hosting next week. Next slide, please. So this image is the location of our research. You've already seen slides from Bessem and Alex. The LACE studies are actually focused in two regions of the southwest littoral region of Cameroon, peri-urban Limbe and rural Boya. Next slide, please. And LACE 1 was designed to be carried out in the context of the National LPG Master Plan, which Alex talked about. And it had a number of exploratory aims, namely to describe the LPG market ecosystem in Cameroon. So we looked at national data sets, public reports, and carried out a literature review. And then we conducted empirical research to identify enablers and barriers in LPG adoption and more exclusive use. We also wanted to summarize the impacts of the partial and exclusive use of LPG on household air pollution, safety, and the households themselves. And finally, we plan to update the ecosystem model based on our findings from LACE 1. So our approach involved mixed methods empirical research, including surveys, interviews, focus group discussions, and instrumentation for household air pollution and stave use monitoring. Next slide, please. The first phase of LACE 1 involved rapid census type surveys conducted in regions of rural Boya. We contacted all available households during the census period for the rural communities, and peri-urban Limbe, where we took a stratified random sample from the approximately 20,000 households of Mile 4, for a total sample size of 1,500. Next slide, please. The census was used to provide a sampling frame for household surveys of different fuel-using groups, as well as to examine patterns of fuel use by socioeconomic status and other household characteristics. And we also asked quite a lot of detail about household perspectives on LPG as a domestic fuel. Next slide, please. Now, this graph shows the proportion of households reporting their primary fuel by rural and peri-urban communities. The two dominant fuels are LPG and wood, similar to national estimates. And as expected, the distribution of LPG differed significantly between rural and peri-urban areas. Almost 60% of the peri-urban respondents reported LPG as their primary fuel, compared to only about 15% of rural households. And of the rural households, 80% reported primary use of wood. Next slide, please. So when we look at LPG as both a primary and secondary fuel, it's clear that very few households use LPG exclusively. Even in the peri-urban communities, less than 10% reported exclusive use, with only 1% in rural communities. And clearly amongst LPG users, there's a lot of stove stacking or mixed fuel use. Next slide, please. So the second phase of LACE 1 was to conduct more detailed household surveys in samples of the three fuel using groups. That's LPG primary, including the exclusive users, the mixed LPG wood users, that's LPG being used as a secondary fuel, and the wood exclusive users. Next slide, please. So this graph shows some findings from the household surveys. It shows monthly household income by fuel group, and the LPG primary users have been split into exclusive and non-exclusive groups. By far, the majority of LPG users reported incomes above the national Cameroon average monthly wage, with approximately 80% reporting incomes above 50,000 South African francs. That's about $90 Central African francs. Conversely, amongst wood users, 70% of households reported incomes below this level, and in fact 15% reported income levels less than the poverty threshold of 25,000 CFA, which is about $45. Next slide, please. So to assess the impact of primary fuel use on levels of household air pollution, we recruited households from our LPG primary groups and wood exclusive fuel use groups. Next slide, please. And from each sample, respirable particulate matter, that's PM2.5, was measured both for kitchen concentrations and also exposures for women and children. And we used micro-PEM technology for this. For those of you who don't know micro-PEMs are small battery-powered instruments. They have an internal pump, and they draw air at a predefined rate through a pre-weighed filter, collecting particles from incomplete combustion. And the micro-PEMs were placed in kitchens and worn by women and children in bespoke aprons, and you can see that in the pictures here. Micro-PEMs were recorded for 48-hour periods. Okay, so, and then finally, stove use monitoring was carried out over a 7-day period for the participating households. And we used K-Sun thermocouples for the traditional stoves and I-buttons for the gas burners. And both of these technologies record temperature fluctuations, allowing cooking periods to be identified. And for the women, primary cooks collected time activity diary information as well. Next slide, please. So we've had a first round analysis of the differences in levels of household air pollution between the two groups, between the wood exclusive and LPG user groups. This slide shows the reductions in PM2.5 micrograms per meter cubed in kitchens from using LPG as a primary fuel. In the exclusive wood users, the median concentration was 447.9 micrograms per meter cubed, compared to only 21.1 in the LPG primary users. So the interim target, WHO interim target 1, is 35 micrograms per meter cubed. So you can see that in terms of concentrations, LPG appears to be getting below this level. Next slide, please. But so this is a preliminary look at the exposure data in women for LACE 1. So it's the differences in the wood and LPG exclusive groups. And these exposures were considerably lower than the observed kitchen concentrations, with wood exclusive users having a median PM2.5 of 52.4 compared to 14 in LPG users. And we're currently trying to understand the contextual factors that might have explained these low exposures relative to the observed kitchen concentrations. One factor could be related to seasonality, as all the measurements were carried out in the dry season, when the women are more likely to use outdoor kitchens. But we're going to be exploring this in more detail. Next slide, please. The complementary qualitative research we conducted included semi-structured interviews with households from different fuel use groups, together with focus group discussions with the rural and peri-urban communities. Next slide, please. We also carried out semi-structured interviews with stakeholders, including marketers, distributors, retailers, as well as with community leaders. Next slide, please. So I've got an example of some of the relevant data we found that are going to be shown in the next couple of quotes. I've selected these because they provide some rationale for the interventions that are being evaluated in LACE 2. This first quote shows one of the barriers to adoption that was identified by the households relating to the affordability of the initial purchase of LPG equipment that Bessem was talking about. So this participant said that many of them are farmers and cannot accumulate money. Nobody can spend a lot of money in one go. They have to continue to gather money gradually, and that is why the whole process is slow. Next quote, please. So the second quote relates to a barrier to more exclusive use of LPG, relating to a reluctance to use gas for cooking foods with a long cooking duration. This participant noted that we prepare fufu corn or corn chaff, like kwakoko and koki, on the fireside, as using the gas cooker will consume more gas. So that's why I said things like plantain can be prepared on a gas, but fufu corn is on the fireside. Next slide, please. Therefore, LACE 2 was developed to look at how some of these potential barriers might be addressed in the community. And in this regard, there were three primary aims. Next slide, please. Firstly, to assess the impact of a loan to fund the initial purchase of LPG startup kits. So this is the microfinance initiative that Bessem's talked about. And we wanted to look at how this impacted in terms of household air pollution and cooking and fuel use practices. The second aim was to assess the impact of a pressure cooker intervention on stove use, and this was in terms of transitioning away from traditional stove use and wood fuel. And the pressure cooker was offered as a potential solution to cooking foods with long durations. Next slide, please. And thirdly, we wanted to find community solutions to perceived barriers to adoption and sustained use of LPG. And for this, we used innovative participatory methods using photo voice research. Next slide, please. So the first LACE 2 project was the microfinance evaluation. It's being carried out from February when it was launched, and we're just completing data collection now. We're evaluating the pilot as a before and after study with a control community comparison for the 6-month loan period. Next slide, please. Within the Batuque intervention community, we're evaluating all the 150 beneficiaries. This includes a baseline and follow-up survey, as well as monitoring repayments and refill purchases, and Bessem's presented some of those findings. We're also measuring household air pollution in kitchens and also for the women exposures in a sample of 35 of the beneficiary households, again at baseline and 6 months follow-up. And finally, we're conducting community surveys in Batuque with approximately 500 households to collect information about cooking practices, fuel use, and LPG adoption within the 6-month loan period. Next slide, please. For a control comparison, we're conducting the same surveys in a control community. This has a similar socio-demographic profile, and it's in a region called community called Botaland. And like I say, we're coming to the end of data collection for the post-intervention follow-up. Next slide, please. The pressure cooker intervention is being carried out from May until the end of September in the Mile 4 community, and this includes households from LACE 1 that reported mixed wood and LPG use, and where traditional foods cooked included those with long durations such as beans, cassava, cocoyam, etc. The pressure cookers were locally sourced, and we provide training in their safety and use together with a recipe and safety book we developed with local chefs. The pressure cookers costed around 25,000 Central African francs. That's about $45. Next slide, please. The study had a randomized control design and with a 4-month follow-up period. So 140 households were randomly allocated to intervention, that's pressure cooker, and control groups. At baseline and follow-up, households received a survey of cooking and fuel use patterns, including quite a detailed evaluation of the types of meals that are cooked. And in addition, a random 50% sample of intervention and control households were also measured for displacement of traditional wood fuel. And we did this using 7-day stove use monitoring, again with K-sums and I-buttons, and also with time activity diaries. And finally, we conducted semi-structured interviews with 10 households to get information and perspectives on using the pressure cookers. and also changes in behaviour after the 4 months using the pressure cooker. Next slide, please. So the final part of LACE 2 was the photo voice study that was conducted with 2 groups of participants. We had a group from rural Boya and a group from peri-urban Limbe. Now, photo voice has a 5-step methodology that's shown here. Firstly, a focus group discussion was held, introducing the method and training the participants in the use of photography, and also identifying the issues that we wanted to investigate, that is, barriers and potential solutions to using LPG free photography. The participants then took photographs over a 1 to 2 week period before receiving a semi-structured interview where we explored the meanings and the context of the pictures before selecting the most relevant or important photographs from the participants' own viewpoint. They then discussed the chosen photographs in a wider focus group discussion before selecting a core set to display in posters with captions explaining those contexts. And the final stage with the method is that participants have the opportunity to communicate their findings to the wider community. And this is done in the form of a photographic exhibition. And as you'll see, we're holding this as part of a wider public engagement event. Next slide, please. So during this presentation, I've summarised the LACE 1 project and presented some of our preliminary findings, as well as describing the work we're undertaking for LACE 2. LACE 1's now complete, and the results are being prepared for final reporting. And we're currently looking closely at the household air pollution results, because we're hoping to use these to model national health impacts from scaling up LPG in line with the government targets using the HAPIT tool. LACE 2 data collection for the microloan and pressure cooker interventions is due to be completed in October, so we're hoping to have our first findings prepared for dissemination in the first quarter of 2018. And in September, next week, we're disseminating our photo voice results as a photographic exhibition as part of a public and stakeholder engagement event. Next slide, please. And the event's going to be held at the Museum of Handicrafts in Mile 4. It's an opportunity for communities to communicate issues with LPG stakeholders and decision makers, and it includes representatives from the Cameroon Ministries of Health and Energy. We're going to host the photo voice exhibition, and there'll be presentations by stakeholders, a panel discussion, and interactive displays showcasing the LACE studies. And the event's being covered by both local and national media. Next slide, please. So I'd just like to acknowledge our funders in this last slide, and to personally thank the fieldwork team and the research participants. I'd also particularly like to thank BESM for all the support she's given us in setting up the fieldwork for the LACE studies. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. We'll move on to, pardon, let me get this going real quick. I think my system has collapsed a bit, but anyway, this will be a perfect time for Q&A session, and I would like to allow the Alliance, first of all, to thank Alex, Bessem, and Dr. Pope for your terrific presentations. I'm confident that our partners and participants in today's webinar learned and gained a lot of interesting insight from these various LPG interventions. To that, we do have some terrific questions that have come in throughout the webinar, and I will take a few minutes to just collect some of them, discern some emerging themes, and dole them out to the various presenters. So, let's see. Okay. Let Maybe we can start maybe a little closer to the beginning. So maybe some of these questions will be directed towards you, Alex. One question is, what is the unsubsidized price per meal or per day for LPG cooked meals versus wood? This, I believe, question was potentially in reference to a slide you had up, Alex. Let me unmute you. All right.
That for Cameroon specifically, that's best a BESM question.
Okay.
My memory is a bit out of date as to what people pay at the moment.
Sure. Bessem, can you shed some insight?
Yeah, yeah, he's asking for unsubsidized price. What everybody knows in Cameroon is a subsidized price, which is 6,500 for a 12.5 kilograms cylinder, which translates to about how much is that? I'm thinking in dollars now. 10, about $12 for a 12.5 kg cylinder. That is the subsidized rate. The unsubsidized rate is not a rate that every household has. So we mainly know the subsidized rate, not the unsubsidized.
Great, thank you.
If you were to spread that cost over meals paid for where LPG is the exclusive fuel, you're probably looking at a little bit under $1 a meal.
Terrific. And Bessem, staying with you, this question that's come in asks, all right. One question pertains to the potential of pay-as-you-go for small quantities of LPG. A example that they cited that as a potential model for this is the EnviroFit smart gas system. Any thoughts onto the viability of this and any interesting or potential research that's come out of this?
Well, we've had a, sorry.
Maybe I'll take that one. We've had a lot of dialogue with various pay-as-you-go providers. There are a lot of different models for how people are trying to do it. The EnviroFit system uses a technology developed by COPA in Southern Africa. And the basic premise is that if people can't save up enough to buy a $12 refill of a cylinder, for example, they might be able to afford $1 or $2 at a time by having a smaller quantity refilled. And there are a couple of different ways that can be done. One is that you can have, using for example, the EnviroFit monitoring system. It's essentially a way of metering the level of gas in the cylinder and then arranging in a logistically efficient way to swap out the empty cylinder for a full one when the consumer reaches a certain point or has a certain amount they would like to repay based on their household budget. So in principle, that could help consumers who do not have a savings mechanism essentially finance a monthly refill in terms of micro steps during the course of a month. And that might be helpful as a way to eventually develop the savings regimes that have been developed in other countries to support larger cylinders. A major issue is, can that be done affordably, given that the technology has a very substantial cost addition to the total package of equipment. So that is what's going to be determined in the market using that particular model. Certain of the other models for pay-as-you-go have safety implications which have not been well addressed yet and represent an area of risk that we're looking at very closely. And we're in discussions with basically everybody in the world about these sorts of models to see which ones may end up being helpful at expanding the market among the poor and which ones may be unexpectedly destructive for sustaining the market, both among the poor and among better off households. So the jury remains out on whether it's economic, which model will work, how widely they will work, and how sustainable they are. But we're, in principle, very supportive of the innovation that it represents as ways to deal with the household economics of LPG.
Great, thanks, Alex. Bessem, did you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, just like Alex was saying, an alternative could be having a smaller size cylinders, maybe a kilogram or a 6 kilogram, just so it could be legislation that the household should be able to reach to a 6 kilogram of gas when she cannot afford for a 10.5 kilogram. That could be another alternative. But I know for Cameroon, there was a commercial company that started to pay as you go. But of course, some of the safety issues, as raised by Alex, we couldn't continue with that. The legislation was against it. So it's actually to find a model that is not only sustainable, but that is safe, and that could be fully scalable. So it's either a smaller size cylinder or the ability to switch from one size cylinder to another. So that could also be a form of solution. Great.
A few questions related to safety, and in particular, one participant asks if anyone on the panel is aware of any statistics on safety from those countries that have successfully adopted LPG.
This is Alex. We are disappointed by the level of safety monitoring information which is available in a standard way globally, and it's an important area to be strengthened. However, there are a number of trails of information, sometimes government collected, sometimes obtained through industry groups, sometimes tracked by the media, country by country, on the levels of incidence of safety accidents in the LPG sector, and what their cause is, whether they're an industrial or supply chain issue, whether they're a bad cylinder, whether consumer misuse, that sort of thing. So while I can't give a precise answer in this format, country by country, on what the statistics are, suffice it to say that in the countries which have developed widespread LPG use, the level of accidents has gone way down, and in cases of certain of those countries, the level of accidents was the reason that they reformed the LPG sector in order to make it safe and therefore accepted by the population. So for one specific example, in Brazil, in the 1970s, when Brazil was going through a market implosion in LPG due to safety issues, they were having 3,000 major incidents a month, explosions a month, many of which resulted in fatalities. So a truly horrendous problem. And that galvanized action by the public and by government and by industry to reform the market and do so in a way which brought that factor, that level of safety incidents down by at least 100-fold.
Great. So we have a few questions here requesting some clarity on, I suppose, cost breakdowns when it comes to providing LPG. When we're discussing costs of providing this fuel for cooking, what are you including in your assessments, and what have you disregarded? For example, when you discuss infrastructure like storage, piping, is that included in your assessment, or are you disregarding that for this pilot phase? Hope that made sense.
It does.
Okay.
So the LPG cost, as borne by the end user in each country, whether regulated or unregulated, then is an easy number to use for analyzing the consumer side costs. So you have equipment cost, and we deal with that separately from ongoing fuel cost. And the fuel cost, by definition, includes the cost recovery of all necessary infrastructure, distribution, industry margins, and so forth, which build up to a final price. That price may also be affected by whether there's regulation and government subsidy involved or not. So for analytical purposes, although we do unpack that number in order to plan investment projects and the viability of business enterprises and so forth, to analyze the household, it's all summarized inside that final price to the end user. So that's an all-in price with respect to the fuel.
Great. Yep, that was a good question.
Yes, exactly. And if you look at the price structure, like the LPG price structure in Cameroon, you look at it, it has all those segments for infrastructure, for the cylinder, everything is inclusive. So the end user price of 6,500 plants is inclusive of all of that. So, yeah.
Terrific. And a question pertaining on Cameroon's broader clean cooking energy access policies for the country. One question asks if the country is, in addition to promoting LPG, are they also including other cooking technologies as part of their energy access goals?
The short answer is yes. The LPG initiative with the government got started a bit faster in Cameroon than the work on the Sustainable Energy for All action agenda and investment prospectus process that all the sub-Saharan African countries are pursuing at one pace or another. So in the Sustainable Energy for All process, there are a broader set of solutions being considered and sort of allocated within the national energy mix. I will mention that for our process, we never allow the government and the stakeholders, to the extent we can influence them, to look at LPG in a vacuum. We always have to look at LPG as part of a holistic energy strategy and clean cooking strategy and decide, based on good evidence, what role LPG should play relative to other solutions, not both in the beginning and over time. As to what the Cameroonian authorities are looking at in terms of the other solutions, that I unfortunately cannot speak to. Bessem, if you have already participated in any of the sustainable energy meetings, since you are a representative on that committee, perhaps you can add something about what you've learned.
Yeah, in the meeting of the month of August, the Sustainable Energy for All meeting, the Director of Petroleum Resources, after the presentation from the representative of the UN Sustainable Energy for All, made it clear that even as much as Cameroon is looking at other clean cooking solutions, Cameroon wants to focus on LPG for now. That's a short-term and mid-term strategy to focus on LPG. This statement was made public by the Director of Petroleum Resources, and he gave the argument that we are expecting good level of LPG end of 2017 from the Kribi terminal. So, the LPG supply in Cameroon is going to be huge, so they want to focus most of their attention on LPG. That's one of the recommendations of the August Sustainable Energy for All meeting. And it came highly recommended that the team of Sustainable Energy for All should get in contact with the Global LPG Partnership to see ongoing work, so that at one point there could be a meeting point for both work done so far by the Global LPG Partnership and the ongoing work with the Sustainable Energy for All.
Great. Yeah, and I think that also addresses another question on broader energy policies for Cameroon as they continue to develop. See, maybe we'll take one or two more, and for other questions we can answer maybe electronically. So let's move on to the next. Let's see. Okay, so a question here regarding, let's see. A question here on the source or the manufacturer for the two-burner cooker and what the cost is.
The cookstove burner is based in Douala. It's not a local manufacturer. It's been imported, but they have a big warehouse in Douala from where it's passed. And the initial cost of that burner ranges from 22,000 to 25,000. That is about how much is that in US dollars? About 30, 25 US dollars, I'm thinking. Let me see. So, 25,
okay.
So it's about, yeah, so it's roughly about 45 US dollars for the stove. But given the quantities that GLPGP is taking, the LPG negotiated for a discount. So instead of about 45 USD, the LPGP is paying for them on behalf of the consumer 38 US dollars.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay. So, all right. I think we have one question here. For Dr. Pope, for Daniel specifically, it's not clear to me if this is specific to a type of research or to this assessment in particular, but the question is, what are your future research plans in Cameroon, both quantitative and qualitative, that I suppose beyond the scope that you've already outlined in the presentation? Or maybe any other remaining research questions that you'd like to explore.
Thanks very much. Yeah. So, yeah, for LACE 3, we would like to carry out some more work in Cameroon. We'd like to repeat some of our evaluation work in the Francophone region of Cameroon, and we've already begun scoping out suitable communities in central Cameroon. We'd also like to expand the evaluation of the microfinance model to other communities working with GLPGP. So I think Bessem's talked a little bit about their aspirations to go beyond the Batike pilot, and we'd be very happy to sort of be involved in the evaluation. We're also very keen to find out more about the issues of gathering free fuel and the competing costs of biomass relative to LPG, which we've seen a lot of during the fieldwork for LACE 1 and LACE 2. And I guess also we'd like to look more at the commercial use of wood and, versus LPG for cooking. So, for example, in Limbe, the fish smoking industry uses an awful lot of locally sourced wood, some of it renewable, some of it not. And possibly looking also at street vendors in Douala that there's a lot of biomass used for the food industry. So they're sorts of things we'd like to look at, and we'll be looking at, well, hopefully scoping funding sources for this future work.
Okay.
Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you. So, okay, one question with regards to the security deposit, and it is along the lines of why were new users asked to pay a refundable security deposit instead of making the $11 as part of the initial payment? Anybody like to take a stab at that?
This is Alex. I was hopeful that Bessem would, but we may have.
I didn't get the question. Sorry.
Sure, I'm happy to repeat it. The question was pertained to why were new users asked to pay a refundable security deposit instead of making the $11 as part of the initial payment?
Okay, the security deposit was meant as an issue of interest. I think it's quite familiar and usual that if you are requesting for any sort of loan, they always ask for your personal effort to be able to apply that loan. If you're asking for a $10, they want to see what you have. So the security deposit was, first of all, to make sure that they are actually interested in the loan, their willingness to be part of the loan. And that's why it was stated that it was going to be refunded. But along the line, as the repayments were going on, we realized that after some households paid the fifth installment, they stopped paying. So we informed the Gango Association Batoke that we're going to use the security deposit as seed payment. We just credit as a loan to credit the accounts. Initially, it's just to show interest, but along the line, we realized that we could use it for just as a seed payment. But in the model that we are thinking of expanding now, we are still going to use the security deposit, but it's going to be in a different format. Also, it automatically credits the lendee's account. But it's needed just so we know they're interested.
Great, thank you, Bessem. I think we'll take two more questions at this point. One of them asks, was there a guarantee mechanism put in place either by the global partnership or other parties that covered the risks to MFIs and FIs as they work to finance these households?
Well, as we started, it's true we didn't take any credit score. We didn't credit the beneficiaries to start with. No credit score. We just decided to give out the loan to the first 150 who came. But in the clauses that we have, the Gango Association Batoke is responsible for those beneficiary households. So, and the Gango Association is headed by the chief of the community. So he's heading that association, and he has the responsibility for the members of his community to repay the loans. So for now, that's the guarantee that we have, and that's why we are saying it's a pilot, and there are many learnings that we are getting out of that.
Let me add a little bit to that, if I may. For the sake of this pilot, the loan capital came from Global LPG Partnership at 0 interest, and Global LPG Partnership took the full risk of non-repayment on that loan capital. So the MFI was not contributing its own capital, and its costs were covered as part of the overall project budgeting. So they took the risk with their time and the reputation, but not with money. The commercial partners take risk on the resources to create repeat business in the case of the LPG company, but the costs they bear to acquire a customer are not at risk because the customers are simply being created for them by the program. However, for the next phase of the program, to put it on a more commercial footing, we are in discussions with the partners about how to share risk in a different way, and we foresee our funds being used in a more traditional guarantee mechanism or partial guarantee mechanism rather than assuming all of the risk up front. And the reason we were willing to do that for this pilot was because this was a new concept in Cameroon. No one had any experience in it. And as Bessem said in her presentation, it was a necessary comfort to the partners to know we were willing to do that in order for them to work with us to brave the new frontier. And having done that, they have enough comfort now that they are open-minded to a more traditional sharing of risk and sharing of wholesale capital.
Great. Okay, I think we'll end on one last question, which might be a very large question, but we're here to ask the hard ones. One individual asks about, is there a point in time that the government of Cameroon may need to taper off their investment in LPG and switch to solar and wind over the course of the next 50 years? And I think, Alex, you've discussed that it is the position of the partnership to have a holistic view of energy mix and energy access. But is there a future? Maybe we can ask what your vision for the future of LPG is in Cameroon and how they'll coincide with a broader energy policy for the country.
That's a great big picture question. I would love for Global LPG Partnership to be put out of business by a totally green and renewable solution that delivers the same kind of results and same benefits. So we view ourselves as transitional in that sense, saving lives, saving trees, mitigating climate now, while the other technologies and distribution systems and infrastructure are built out or might arise, which can allow LPG to be phased out, or to give time for bio-LPG, which exists now in small commercial quantities in certain parts of the world, to become a big enough alternative to traditional LPG that traditional LPG can be displaced. So we watch solar closely. It's making tremendous gains in terms of cost, reliability, life cycles, duty cycles, that sort of things. Eventually, if it can produce the kind of instant heat and intensity of heat that allows for cooking the kind of dishes Dan Pope talked about, that would be fabulous. But I don't think we're there yet, and it may be 10 or 20 years or 50 years, as the questioner suggests, before electrification or biofuels or some other totally green renewable solution works better than LPG does today. And in the case of the Cameroon government, they don't seem to have a planning horizon out to 2060, from what I have heard. They are looking out 15 years, and as Bessem said, LPG is driving the strategy for that 15-year period. And as they get towards the end of it, I am hopeful that there will be progress on these other fronts, and the government will take a fresh, holistic look at the balance of LPG, bio-LPG, if it's then available, and other technologies, and reshuffle the allocation in their energy strategy and their energy mix for the people.
Great. Well, I think that's a really hopeful note to end this webinar on. Before I conclude, I wanted to point out that it was brought to my attention that the cost per meal for LPG may have been overstated during this webinar. When urban Cameroon LPG at least is less expensive than coal. So wanted to bring that to everyone's attention so this was not misleading. Well, on that note, thank you again, Alex, Bessem, Daniel, for a really wonderful presentation. Thank you again to all of the participants who stuck with us till the very end. We hope you found this presentation interesting and insightful, and we do hope you will continue participating in future webinars with the Alliance. If you have any other comments, you have any other questions you would like to have answered, you can always email the Alliance at info@cleancookstoves.org, and we will try our best to get back to you within a few business days. Thank you again to the panel. Thank you, and have a great rest of the day or evening, wherever you are in the world. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thanks very
everyone.
much. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.